In 1984, the Ministry of Love is a place where the disobeyers of the party go, where they are brainwashed to believe the way of the party. They do not do it with persuasion. They use torture methods. They use different kinds of pain, and you endure that pain until you accept the way of the party, just like Winston did. And in the end, after all that torture, he realized he loved Big Brother. George Orwell didn't only predict these torture cases, but they exist today on a much larger scale. Guantanamo Bay, also known as Gitmo, is a detention camp located in southern eastern Cuba. The people held at Guantanamo Bay are called detainees. The camp was opened by President George W. Bush, and it was meant to hold terrorist suspects that were captured overseas. Well, Guantanamo Bay didn't turn out that way. Instead, the camp keeps people in prison without charge, and because the prisoners are not on United States grounds, George W. Bush stated that the U.S. had no obligations to grant any constitutional rights to the detainees, and they were denied most legal prosecutions. More than 700 detainees have been held at Guantanamo Bay, the youngest being only 14 years old. The 700 detainees were from 49 different nations. The people who were detained were sold into the army with the false accusations that they were terrorists. About 400 detainees have been released or transferred, and more than $445 million was spent by the U.S. Defense Department to get Guantanamo Bay opened. In 2006, the federal courts were denied access of writing petitions for foreign detainees, but in 2008, the court deemed that detainees were allowed the right to challenge their detentions in the federal courts. Despite the court's decisions, several detainees who had been cleared for release in other countries or for transfer to their home country continued to be detained, either because no country would accept them or because their home country deemed too volatile to guarantee their secure imprisonment. There have been protests against Guantanamo Bay where people dress in prison uniforms with bags over their heads and hold signs that speak for the detainees. Several international human rights organizations repeatedly condemn the camp for human rights violations, such as torturous interrogation methods, but Bush's administration claimed that all detainees were well cared for and that their interrogation methods were not torturous. On January 22, 2009, President Barack Obama ordered the closure of Guantanamo Bay, but the closure was delayed due to the opposition of Republicans and some Democrats that putting the detainees in U.S. prisons would place national security at risk. Recently, President Donald Trump signed an executive order that revives overseas black site prisons, which were CIA programs where terrorist suspects were interrogated and tortured. Those practices that were widely condemned during Bush's time are to be re-examined. Trump also plans to keep Guantanamo Bay opened. Guantanamo Bay and the new black sites show a trend in wrongful torturing, and they are set outside of U.S. territory to perform any acts deemed necessary on the detainees. Detainees at Guantanamo Bay are sometimes interrogated for 18 to 20 hours a day, for 48 of 54 days. Even though the torture was banned from the camp almost 10 years ago, it continues to go on today. Guantanamo Bay torture tactics include waterboarding, which is when a detainee is strapped to a board with the feet elevated and a towel is held over their face tightly. Water is then poured onto the towel and the detainee's mouth and sinuses fill with water. The incline of the board keeps the water level below the lungs, preventing drowning, but their breathing becomes labored and the subject begins to panic. A second interrogation tactic is sleep deprivation. Detainees are stripped of sleep for days and even weeks. Sleep deprivation is used because it reduces the body's ability to resist pain and makes the detainee more liable to cooperate with the investigators. A third interrogation tactic is force feeding. Force feeding is normally only used on the detainees that go on hunger strikes. This technique involves supplying nutritional substances to the detainee via tube that is passed through the nose or mouth. This causes severe pain to the detainee. A fourth interrogation tactic is dogs. Dogs are used as a way of scaring the detainee. They run and bark at them, and sometimes the dogs go as far as to biting the detainee. A fifth one is beatings. Detainees would be beaten for 3 to 4 hours and put in chains until they started to bleed. Then the detainee would be turned over to another team and a different torture tactic was used. Some ways to attempt to get Guantanamo Bay closed is publicly defend transfer of detainees out of Guantanamo Bay. Highlight the important changes the administration has made in the policy and practice of evaluating detainees for potential transfer. Correct misconceptions about the ability of U.S. prisons to safely hold Guantanamo detainees. Say no to any legislations that impose transfer restrictions on Guantanamo detainees, including restrictions on transfers to the United States and to Yemen. Increase efforts to develop rehabilitation and reintegration programs to allow for transfer of Yemeni detainees. Direct the Department of Justice not to oppose petitions for detainees who are either too sick or too old to pose a security threat. End the military commissions and prosecute detainees who have committed crimes in civilian courts. Direct the Secretary of Defense to transfer detainees to the fullest extent possible, consistent with applicable law. Transfer eligible detainees to a civilian court in the United States or to an appropriate foreign jurisdiction. Transfer detainees serving military commission sentences to an appropriate high-security federal prison in their home countries to serve the remainder of their sentence. Transfer the detainees being held in law of war detention to an appropriate high-security federal prison until the end of hostilities. Manage the risk posed by resettlement by facilitating rehabilitations and monitoring and developing security programs in countries receiving detainees to ensure that transfers are consistent with U.S. national security interests and international legal obligations.